Join Snoqualmie Valley Museum in exploring the history of the arrival of railways in towns in the 1880s. The railroad changed everything. The Snoqualmie people have lived in the valley for thousands of years and had over 18 villages at the time of contact. The majority of our current towns and cities are built on top of those village sites. The exact locations of the current towns shifted slightly with the arrival of the railway compared to where those villages were and compared where settlers first began living. Before the arrival of the railway, there were no towns platted under the United States legal system that governs town and city laws today. The villages tended to be linear along the river rather than condensed in a multi-street system. A village is a small community in a rural area, while a town is a populated area with fixed boundaries and a local government. A city is a large or important town. A town has a population of less than 1,500 at the time of its organization and does not operate under the optional municipal code. Some of the villages may or may not now have been considered towns under today's definitions, but because they were not built on a grid system at the time, they were not recognized as such. Prior to the completion of transcontinental railroads, 1869 and later, the Pacific Northwest and the Puget Sound in particular had remained largely unaffected by the industrialization and globalization taking place across the world in the 1700s and 1800s. As railways arrived, they dramatically changed life for those around them. Railroads touched the lives of all people. Whether it was the food people ate, the products they bought for their home, or the mail they received, all of these things were at one time shipped by rail. Railroads move people. Whether it was for settlement, leisure travel, or commuting to work, railroads made the movement of people faster and more efficient. The Puget Sound region in the Snoqualmie Valley offered an array of natural resources that could be exploited once transportation systems were in place. After the immediate needs of nearby communities were met, much of the agricultural and industrial production was for the export market since the region's initial population was relatively small. These industries provided a focus for new settlement as workers generally made their homes near their jobs. In some cases, these settlements were ephemeral and consisted of camps or crude shacks and cabins that were in use only until an area was logged or a prospect played out. Other settlements were built for permanence, sometimes as company towns to ensure workers remained near the job, but sometimes at a crossroads or transportation center. A variety of community institutions, schools, churches, stores, and social organizations brought an element of stability. However, without a nearby industry or market for their products, even some of these more organized communities eventually disappeared. Prior to 1872, the name Falls City did not exist. Previously, the area was informally known as The Landing. From 1872 to 1886, Falls City was the name of the post office in Boham's Trading Post. The Landing officially became Falls City in 1887 with the filing of the Plat of the Town of Falls City, King County, Washington Territory, by Jeremiah and Kate Canham Borst. The first Northern Transcontinental, the Northern Pacific, was completed in 1883. Its western terminus was Tacoma, Washington. Other railroads and connections followed later. The Great Northern Railway, 1893, and the Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound Railway, 1909, also completed transcontinentals. Transcontinental connections were established by Canadian Pacific, 1885, Canadian Northern, 1915, and Union Pacific, 1898. Under the 1864 legislation passed by Congress to assist with railroad construction costs, Congress granted 40 miles of odd-numbered sections of land on either side of tracks as repayment for their huge investments in building railway lines. The Northern Pacific Railroad obtained the largest of these grants, representing more than 9.6 million acres or about 22% of Washington's land area. In the territories, the Northern Pacific was granted odd-numbered sections for 40 miles on either side of the proposed track as indemnity or repayment for their huge investments in building the lines. Lands already occupied by settlers were exempted from this grant, but the railroad was given the opportunity to select lieu lands or replacement parcels in other adjacent areas. The purchase of property that was initially part of railroad land grants was another critical avenue of land acquisition for settlement in King County. With their land grants, Northern Pacific and other railways nationally quickly sold land to settlers to farm and to industries to log and mine. Lands that had been utilized for over 12,000 years by the Coast Salish peoples were quickly and irrevocably altered by alien forms of land use. The original expectation was that the railroad would sell most of its land to individual settlers, but instead, a substantial portion went to corporations. Frederick Weyerhaeuser, for example, purchased 900,000 acres for his timber empire, much of it in Washington, for $6 per acre. Average land prices for settlers often began at $2.50 per acre but reached as much as $20 per acre in some areas. If the notion of the public land policy was to support the egalitarian ideal of an agrarian society of small-scale producers, then, according to critics, the railroad grants had failed to achieve that goal. Frustrated with the lack of connection to the Northern Pacific in Tacoma, Seattle businessmen took connecting to a transcontinental line into their own hands. The Seattle, Lake Shore and Eastern Railway Company, SLS&E, was incorporated on April 25, 1885. A railroad had the greatest opportunity for success if it also controlled waterways, access to fuel, coal, and operated across its own land and its own piers and endpoints. Resources the railroad was hoping to cash in on: coal and gypsum near Squaw Lake, coal, iron, and precious metals from Snoqualmie Pass, hops in Snoqualmie Valley, and timber, grazing, and wheat on both sides of the Cascades. Track reached Snoqualmie Falls by June, and the first of many Sunday excursion trains was July 4, 1889. The agricultural and timber crops of the Upper Valley could now efficiently reach national markets. With the coming of the railroad, town-sized settlements in the region were suddenly more viable. No longer were village-sized settlements and isolated farmsteads the only option in many areas. The 1880s saw the official platting of towns as the railway arrived. July 27, 1887, Falls City platted by Jeremiah and Kate Borst. February 1889, North Bend platted as Snoqualmie Prairie by William Taylor. August 1889, Snoqualmie platted as Snoqualmie Falls by the Snoqualmie Land Improvement Company. November 11, 1889, Washington became the 42nd state of the United States of America. In Snoqualmie, the original plans for the town included a hotel and park catty corner to the Snoqualmie Depot on the lot at the corner of King Street and Railroad Avenue and King Street and Falls Avenue. A railroad bridge at what is now Sandy Cove Park and a ferry landing at the end of Newton Street where the park is now. Entrepreneurs bought lots and started businesses catering to the needs of permanent and temporary visitors. On June 20, 1889, the first train arrived in the Upper Valley, stopping at the bridge just before North Bend. The first tourist excursion train to the Snoqualmie Falls came just 2 weeks later on July 4, 1889. Tourism exploded as the railroad brought the beauty of Snoqualmie Falls and Mount Si and the valley's hunting, hiking and fishing opportunities to the world. A Snoqualmie tribe perspective.
There were some Snoqualmie people who chose to move to Tulalip, Muckleshoot, Lummi, Puyallup and so on, because they had to or they had family already living there. They are our relatives to this day. The Snoqualmies who stayed, however, were still in need of a Snoqualmie reservation. In the decades that followed, there were efforts made to secure a Snoqualmie reservation for those unallotted, unenrolled Snoqualmies. McKenna Sweet Dorman, Winter 2018 Snoqualmie Tribe News Magazine.
Early residents. Alice Borst was born July 14, 1872, in the homestead cabin of her father on the present Meadowbrook site. Her parents were Mina Canham and Jeremiah Borst. She was the third of 5 children born to them. In 1876, her mother died in childbirth and was buried near the cabin. She spent a great part of her time with her great-grandmother, who always lived near them in her own cabin. She had a deep affection for her great-grandmother and learned many of the old customs and heard stories of former times and legends from her. When Alice was 18, her father passed away, and the following year she lived and worked at Mr. Tibbetts near Issaquah. The next 2 years, 1892 and 1893, she spent in a Catholic boarding home in Seattle. There she learned to do beautiful sewing and fine, fancy work of various kinds, at which she was very efficient. In 1894, Alice Borst married James Reese, who had come west in 1884 and made his headquarters at Fall City. He was captain on one of the Snohomish Snoqualmie riverboats, where Alice first saw him when she was on her way to Port Townsend to school. They moved to the Tollgate farm where the family was living when Jim and Alice were married in 1894, and she went there to make her home. After that they lived on the ranch, now Silver Creek Tracts. It was in that house that James died, only 4 years after their marriage, on July 7, 1898, leaving her with 2 small sons, Eden and Jerry. Indian Doc was one of the residents living in Fall City when the first settlers arrived. Doc had been a medicine man in his early years but was very elderly by the time the Fall City area was settled. Along about 1900, the community of Fall City built Indian Doc a small shack near the mouth of the raging river. He adapted the home for traditional use by creating a hole in the floor for his fire and a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. Tradition states that the Edmund and Louisa Kinsey family bought the first lots in the new town of Snoqualmie. They had 6 quite entrepreneurial children. Kinsey interests built the first livery stable, hotel, dance hall, meat market, church, etc. 3 of the boys learned photography from a hotel client, and 2 of them, Darius and Clark, became the most famous of all Pacific Northwest logging photographers. In 1890, Leonard and Margaretta Reinig brought their family to Snoqualmie. Leonard made his fortune in the bakery and mercantile business in Seattle. The 2 oldest sons, Otto and Dio, opened the Reinig Brothers store in 1903. It burned in 1908, was rebuilt, and is now the Carmichael's Hardware Building. Otto Reinig was mayor of Snoqualmie from 1905 to 1915 and postmaster for 31 years. Preston, with its lush hills of old-growth fir and cedar, became attractive to the lumber industry in 1891 when it was reached by the railroad. In Seattle, a young Swedish Baptist immigrant, August Lovgren, experienced in construction and lumber manufacturing, witnessed the growing demand for cedar shingles in the aftermath of the Great Seattle Fire of 1889. Lovgren found 80 acres of cedar in Preston, and he convinced other Swedes to help him finance the construction of a shingle mill, founding the Preston Mill Company. He successfully purchased more land and built 2 new lumber mills, one for producing cedar shingles and a second for producing finished lumber from fir. He built a mill upstream along Lake Creek where it joins the raging river. This mill was used to cut rough logs into smaller pieces to send down his 2.5-mile lumber flume to the finishing mills below. The town that grew around the rough-cut mill became Upper Preston. Lovgren recruited workers from Sweden and attracted Swedes already in King County. Many Swedish Baptists responded to brochures boasting good pay and the opportunity to practice their faith freely. Lovgren provided prime land along the raging river for a Baptist church and a town park, complete with a baseball field. He supplied free lumber for the church and built a 4-room school. As the company flourished, he added a company store, a boarding house, and houses for workers. The town strongly reflected Swedish culture, with church services held in Swedish. As the new little towns of North Bend, Snoqualmie, and Falls City were getting on their feet, they were hit very hard by the national recession of 1893. Then, soon after, the hops market collapsed. Bankruptcy stopped construction at a dot on the map just east of North Bend labeled Tanner City, but supplies and tourists, timber and crops could finally quickly move in and out of the valley. The cities soon recovered. By May 1892, the Northern Pacific Railroad had acquired control of the Seattle, Lakeshore and Eastern. However, it was quickly apparent that the SLS&E had been looted by its promoters, and was built to such poor standards a massive investment was required to make it viable. Unfortunately, fraud and mismanagement, coupled with the economic depression that hit in 1893, drove the SLS&E into receivership. On May 16, 1896, the company was sold in foreclosure and reorganized as the Seattle and International Railroad. The SLS&E was legally dead. Within 5 years, the line would again be part of the NP. The present townsite of Duval was once the hillside property homesteaded in the 1870s by Francis and James Duval. The original townsite, called Cherry Valley, was located a half-mile downstream along the banks of the Snoqualmie River. The first Cherry Valley School, built in 1879, was constructed from the wood of a single log. The abundance of jobs in the logging camps caused Cherry Valley to grow. By the 1890s, cattle and dairy farms dotted the fertile valley. Many farm families built on higher ground to accommodate the flooding, which occurs almost every year. In 1892, the Valley House was built as a hotel for travelers. Soon after, a Methodist church and a new school were constructed. In 1905, a swing bridge was built across the river, which later opened up stage travel to and from the ferries on Lake Washington, located 20 miles away. Originally settled in the 1870s, Novelty was named after Novelty, Missouri, the community of town founder James H. Boyce. By 1901, the unincorporated town of Novelty included a post office, church, store, dance hall, and hotel. Novelty does not seem to have been platted as a town, similar to pre-1887 Fall City. The 1900s saw the continued development of towns in the valley. Lumbering and water transportation led to the platting of Tolt, also known as Carnation, in 1902. Jerry Canham with his wife Jenny and grandson at their home in Tolt. The nephew of Chief Potcanham, Jerry Canham became Chief Jerry Canham in 1912 until his death in 1956. His home served as an important meeting place for the Snoqualmie tribe during this era, and the work done there helped provide the legal documentation to help regain recognition. During the Depression, Snoqualmie struggled on. With $300 a lot prices originally placed on lots in 1889, many early settlers bypassed paying the unreasonable price of a lot, built barns, homes, outhouses, orchards, businesses, etc. in the public streets. Finally, the Seattle investors who had platted the town dropped the lot price to $45. Slowly, people bought the lots adjacent to their structures and moved them out of the streets. In 1903, the town voted to incorporate under the laws of the state of Washington, becoming the first incorporated community in the Snoqualmie Valley. The highest paid public official was the sheriff, who was expected to do everything. He built railroad crossings, bridge railings, and sidewalks, upheld the laws, buried dead calves, collected the poll tax, worked all male prisoners each day, attended to the needs of families under quarantine, and notified folks when their water closets were not in a sanitary condition. The job of sheriff was so challenging that, despite the high pay, it changed hands 12 times from 1903 to 1910. By 1909, North Bend had outgrown its 4x4th Street plat. It included a train depot, general stores, 2 hotels, a barber shop, a confectionery, 2 livery stables, a steam laundry, a harness shop, a blacksmith, a jail, a church, a ladies' aid society, a baseball team, several saloons, a school for 96 pupils, 2 drugstores, a jewelry store, a boarding house, and several dozen residences. People living in town ran these businesses in groups, serving farmers and loggers from the surrounding country. The most important employers were the South Fork Logging Company, the North Bend Lumber Company, McCann's Mill, and the Northern Pacific Railroad, which had bought up the track of the Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern. 1909 was a significant year for the valley, as the Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound Railroad, later the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, finally brought a transcontinental railroad through the valley. That same year, the North Bend and Eastern Railroad Company also began operations as a logging railway for the North Bend Lumber Company. A commissary for the construction was set up at Tanner and supplies taken from there to the pass. One unique part of the construction was filling in a gulch 8 miles above North Bend known as Topographer's Gulch. One of the least known and largest fills on record for the time. It consisted of a gap 1,120 feet in length by 123 feet deep that had to be spanned. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound Railway filled in the rift by washing down the adjacent embankment 200 feet at the base, by 282 feet high and 800 feet long. They did this by using hydraulic giants, aka a hydraulic monitor, a device for directing a high-pressure stream of water to wash the soil down into the ravine below. A company town, Moncton, was established in 1906 by the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad while it was carving its transcontinental line through Snoqualmie Pass. It thrived on the picturesque Rattlesnake Prairie within the Cedar River watershed. With this increased growth, Seattle needed more power and water. There had been a small homestead community at Cedar Lake that was condemned to form the Seattle City Light Cedar Falls watershed. With the project, Seattle merged its company town with the railways and a logging company to create Cedar Falls, also known as Moncton, until the spring of 1912 when the name formally changed to Cedar Falls, for the workers to live in. This was one of the few company towns jointly run by multiple companies and industries. The town consisted of 2 parts: Camp 2 at the Dam, a town at what is now Rattlesnake Lake, and the Cedar Falls Watershed Education Center. With the impending arrival of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad in 1909, which was being built east to west, the railroad agreed to move Cherry Valley homes and businesses to the present site of Duval in order to continue the construction of a branch line along the Snoqualmie River. On December 30, 1912, Tolt Incorporated, followed by Duval in 1913. As the 20th century advanced, so did the logging industry in the valley. The company that would come to be known as the North Bend Timber Company was incorporated in 1906 by William C. Weeks and Robert Webb Vintage. W. C. Weeks worked for pioneers Guston and Tibbetts when he arrived from the east in 1889, then bought their general merchandise store, bought local house property and timberland, and by 1909 was a partner in the North Bend Lumber Company. In 1911, the North Bend Lumber Company began operating a sawmill in their company town of Edgewick in King County, which was named for the 2 owners of the company. In the 1890s, plans were made to build an iron smelting factory at Tanner, near the end of the Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern Railway, by Peter Kirk and other regional businessmen. With the Panic of 1893, these plans fell through. However, by the mid-1900s, a substantial lumber mill with an associated company town had been established on the site, owned by the South Fork Lumber Company and managed by L.B. Tanner.
No expense was spared in the building of this plant to make it thoroughly up to date in every particular. Here a timber 120 feet long and 8 feet square can be sawed, and timbers 32 inches square and any length dressed and loaded onto cars for shipment with perfect ease. The capacity is 100,000 feet per day and 120 men are employed in mill and woods, the monthly payroll being over $5,000. Lath and shingle mills are now being built. They are now installing a railroad to connect with some of the company's timber, located farther up the river.
By 1910, the town had a school, a post office, and the mill was the largest employer in North Bend, with over 100 employees. That year, there was a wildfire that swept down Mount Si, burned the school, homes, mill, and burned to the cemetery fence. The mill would be rebuilt multiple times and relocated several times over the next 100 years in the general Tanner area, but it would never develop into a major community like the other towns. In 1900, Weyerhaeuser purchased land in the Snoqualmie Valley that was checkerboarded with Rockefeller timber holdings. The need for building material following the San Francisco 1906 earthquake and fire triggered the purchase of the adjacent pieces of the checkerboard by the Grandin Coast Lumber Company. In 1914, Weyerhaeuser and Grandin Coast incorporated the Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company to build the second all-electric mill in the nation, at Snoqualmie. It took 2 years to plan the mill and begin creating the surrounding mill town of Snoqualmie Falls, Washington. The mill town of Snoqualmie Falls grew to include 250 homes, a general store, 50-bed hospital, a grade school, a community hall, YMCA, a railroad station, a barber shop, a boarding house, and a hotel. By 1916, the towns and cities now known in the valley, as well as some that no longer exist, had been established. Some would flourish in the coming decades, while others would completely disappear within 2 years. To learn more about Snoqualmie Valley history, visit the Snoqualmie Valley Museum in person, Thursday through Tuesday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. or online at snoqualmievalleymuseum.org. We are closed Wednesdays and federal holidays.